The city of New York gleamed with its usual arrogance. Glass towers kissed the clouds, and behind their polished walls sat the men who ruled the world with contracts, deals, and numbers that most people couldn't even imagine. And at the very top of this empire was Richard Sterling, a billionaire whose name once made markets move, whose signature once sealed the fate of companies overnight. But on this particular morning, Richard wasn't the unshakable giant he appeared to be in the newspapers. His empire was trembling. His confidence, which had carried him through decades of victories, was cracking. Today was supposed to be the day he signed the biggest deal of his life, a merger worth billions, a deal that would secure his legacy forever. Yet deep inside, fear gnawed at him. The Sterling Tower boardroom, a vast glass chamber overlooking the city, was already filled with powerful investors. Men in dark suits whispered to each other. Women in sleek dresses scrolled through tablets, and the air vibrated with the weight of money. Everyone expected Richard to walk in, smile with his infamous confidence, and close the deal like he always did. But that didn't happen. When Richard entered, he didn't look like the man they admired. His tie was slightly loose. His eyes darted, nervously. The documents in his hand trembled slightly as he set them down. For the first time, he looked mortal. And seated quietly in the corner of the room, almost invisible to everyone, was Grace. She was Richard's maid, a quiet black woman who had spent years working in his mansion, cleaning the spaces where billion-dollar strategies were born, but never participating in them. She was there only because Richard had asked her to bring in refreshments, a small kindness he often showed her. She thought she would drop the tray and slip out unseen, as always. But fate had other plans. The meeting began. Richard tried to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, clearing his throat, "we are gathered here to finalize a deal that will change the course of Sterling Enterprises forever." But his voice cracked. The words stumbled. He stuttered where he should have been sharp. Investors exchanged glances. Some smirked. One man, bold enough to whisper but loud enough to be heard, muttered, "Is this the legend of Wall Street?" Richard's palms sweated, his notes blurred. He had built an empire with fire and steel, but now, under the cold gaze of investors, he was shrinking. He fumbled through slides that didn't make sense, figures that didn't align, and explanations. That sounded weak. His sentences tangled like broken wires, sparking but never lighting up. The investors began to lose interest. One by one, they leaned back in their chairs, their eyes hardening. A few even started gathering their things, ready to walk out. The billion-dollar deal was slipping through his fingers. And then, it happened. Richard froze. He lost his words entirely. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Silence filled the boardroom like poison. It was the kind of silence that ends. "Careers!" Someone chuckled. Another whispered, "This is over!" Richard Sterling, the man who once made the world listen, had failed miserably. Grace stood frozen in the corner, tray still in her hands. She had seen Richard at his worst before, drunk at midnight, broken by memories, whispering regrets into his glass of whiskey. But she had never seen him like this, destroyed in front of others. Something in her heart twisted. She couldn't explain why, but she couldn't stand there and watch him crumble. The investors began to rise. The deal was collapsing. Richard looked at them with helpless eyes, his empire seconds away from ruin. And then, without warning, Grace moved. She set the tray down on the nearest table, straightened her simple uniform, and walked forward. At first, no one noticed. A maid in a boardroom was invisible. But when she stepped past Richard and turned to face the investors, silence spread again. This time it was different. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with a quiet authority that no one expected. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "before you leave, I want to remind you of something you already know. A company is not just numbers on a page. It is people, ideas, and resilience. Sterling Enterprises has faced storms before, and it has survived them because of vision. Today you're looking at numbers on a slide, but what you should be looking at is the potential for tomorrow. The room stilled. Investors who had been ready to walk out now turned back. Richard stared at her in disbelief. Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. You see a man who stumbled today. But what you don't see is the man who built this empire from nothing. A man who dared when no one else believed. If you cannot trust the presentation, then trust history. If you cannot trust history, then trust the fact that no empire survives without faith. And if you choose to walk out today, you're not walking away from him. You're walking away from yourselves. The words fell like thunder in the room. Investors who had smirked now looked thoughtful. The whispers stopped. Richard sat frozen, watching his maid, the woman who polished his floors, washed his clothes, and carried his trays, stand where he had failed and command the room with nothing but truth. One investor leaned forward. What exactly are you suggesting? Grace smiled slightly. I'm suggesting that sometimes strength isn't in never falling. It's in rising after you do. Sterling Enterprises is rising, and if you are wise, you'll rise with it. Silence. Heavy. Electric. Then, slowly, one investor nodded. Another sat back down. Within moments, the entire room was listening again. Richard's heart pounded. He couldn't believe what was happening. His maid had just done in seconds what he couldn't do in hours. She had saved the deal, and as the room shifted back into negotiations, Richard whispered only one word under his breath. Grace. The boardroom, moments ago heavy with disappointment, now held a strange electricity. The investors who had been ready to walk away were now seated again, their eyes fixed on Grace. Nobody had expected a maid to speak. And yet, once she did, no one could look away. Richard sat silently, his pulse racing. He had built his empire on charisma, but now he was nothing more than a spectator in his own boardroom. The woman who had quietly served him for years was now standing tall, commanding, the room with a strength that left him stunned. Grace paused for a moment, letting the silence work for her. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. Instead, she let her words sink deep into their minds. I know some of you are asking, she said slowly, her eyes sweeping across the long table. Why listen to me? I am not a shareholder. I am not an executive. I am simply a maid. Murmurs rose again. One investor shifted uncomfortably. Another smirked, as if she had just reminded them of her place. But Grace didn't flinch. And yet, she continued, her voice sharper now, sometimes it is the people who stand in the shadows who see the clearest. While others are blinded by numbers, I have watched the man behind them. I have seen his nights of restlessness, his mornings of determination. I have seen failure break him, and I have seen him rise stronger. Richard felt his throat tighten. She had seen him, truly seen him, in ways he never imagined. An older investor, Mr. Whitman, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Miss Grace, is it? Do you really believe this company can recover from what we've seen today? Or are you just giving us words? Grace met his gaze without fear. Words can be empty, yes, but truth is never empty. This company has been more than just numbers for decades. Every building it built, every community it supported, every life it touched, that is real. You see one presentation gone wrong, but I see a foundation too strong to fall. Ask yourself, are you investing in a spreadsheet or are you investing in vision? The room fell quiet again. Even Whitman, the man who had built his fortune on tearing apart weak companies, leaned back with a thoughtful expression. Richard watched in disbelief. These were the same investors who had dismissed him minutes ago. Now they were leaning into every word spoken by his maid. One of the younger investors whispered, "She speaks better than half the executives I've met." Grace's voice softened. "You want guarantees, you want numbers that scream safety, but the truth is, no empire was ever built on guarantees. It was built on courage, on risk, on believing when no one else did. And right now, the courage you need is to stay seated." The sentence struck like lightning. Investors who had been restless now sat still. A few even nodded. Richard felt his shame grow deeper. Here was a woman with no formal education in business, no experience in negotiations, no position of power. And yet, she was saving the very deal he couldn't. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grace." But she didn't turn. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it because she believed it was right. The lead investor, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Hayes, finally spoke. "You speak with conviction, but conviction doesn't write checks. What makes you so certain this company won't collapse under its own weight?" Grace smiled softly, as though she had expected the question. "Because companies don't collapse when they are built on people who refuse to quit. Richard Sterling has refused to quit more times than you can count, and today he will not quit. Because he has people like you willing to believe, and people like me who refuse to watch him fall." The words landed with unexpected weight. For the first time in the entire meeting, the investors didn't see a trembling billionaire. They saw a man surrounded by loyalty, and loyalty, they knew, was priceless. Victoria leaned back, tapping her fingers on the table. "Well," she said at last, "I was prepared to walk away, but now I'm not so sure." A ripple of surprise moved across the table. Investors exchanged looks. The tide was shifting. Grace stepped back slightly, her part seemingly done. She wasn't there to take Richard's place. She was there to hold the line long enough for him to stand again. Richard finally rose to his feet. His legs felt heavy, his heart thundered, but he stood beside Grace. He looked at her, his eyes full, of a gratitude he couldn't put into words. Then he turned to the investors. "My friends," he began, his voice steadier now, "she is right. I lost my voice today. I let fear choke me. But I ask you, look beyond this moment. Look at the decades behind us, the vision ahead of us, and the people who believe in us. If my maid can believe, then so should you." There was no arrogance in his tone now, no empty confidence, just humility and truth. The investors didn't clap, they didn't cheer, but for the first time that day, they listened, truly listened. Grace lowered her eyes, quietly stepping back. She didn't need the spotlight. She had done what needed to be done. And in that quiet moment, Richard Sterling realized something he had never considered in all his years of power. That sometimes strength comes not from the titles we hold, but from the voices we least expect. The deal wasn't saved yet, but it was no longer lost. And for Richard, that meant everything. The tension in the boardroom had not vanished, but it had shifted. The investors, who had once been ready to abandon Richard, now sat with narrowed eyes, curiosity battling with skepticism. Grace had shaken them, no doubt. But words alone were never enough for people who measured their worth in billions. Victoria Hayes, the lead investor, leaned forward again, her sharp gaze fixed on Richard now. "You've got spirit back in this room, Mr. Sterling," she said coolly. "But spirit isn't money. Convince me that my billions are safe with you." Richard hesitated. For a moment, the old fear returned. He looked down at the polished mahogany table, at the papers that had failed him, at the slides that had collapsed. He could feel the weight of their judgment crushing his chest. Then he felt Grace's presence beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't speak. But her silent confidence was louder than anything. He lifted his head. His voice, though trembling at first, grew steadier. You want numbers. You want guarantees. I can't promise you a world without risk. But I can promise you this. No one will fight harder to ensure this company thrives than I will. This business is not just transactions. It is legacy. It is impact. It is lives changed. That is why I built it. That is why I won't let it fall. Some investors still look doubtful, Mr. Whitman scoffed. Pretty words, but you've already failed once today. What makes this time any different? Before Richard could answer, Grace stepped forward again. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. What makes this time different, she said clearly, is that failure has already burned him once. And when you've been burned, you learn. You grow. You don't make the same mistake twice. That is the strength you should be looking at. The room fell into silence again. Victoria raised a brow. You talk about strength, Miss Grace. But tell me, do you even understand the kind of money on the line here? Grace met her gaze with calm defiance. I understand what's on the line better than you think. You see billions in numbers. I see hundreds of families who depend on this company for their daily bread. I see entire neighborhoods that have roofs over their heads because of projects funded here. I see workers who have no safety net except for the jobs this company provides. If that is not worth investing in, then what is? Her words carried a weight no spreadsheet ever could. Some investors shifted uneasily. For the first time, the numbers felt small compared to the scale of humanity Grace described. Richard watched, his chest tightening with a strange mix of pride and shame. Pride, because Grace was extraordinary. Shame, because he realized he had never spoken of his company with such purity. Not in years. Victoria leaned back, tapping her nails against the table. Interesting, she murmured. But passion doesn't pay dividends. Grace didn't back down. No, but it creates them. The line landed like a thunderclap. Even Richard blinked, stunned at her brilliance. One of the younger investors spoke up. She's right. I've seen companies with perfect spreadsheets collapse in months because no one believed in them. Belief matters. Vision matters. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. Richard stepped forward, reclaiming the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice stronger now, I cannot erase the mistake of this morning. I stood here and I failed. But failure is not the end. It is the beginning of resilience. You wanted to see if I could lead when things go wrong. Well, here I am, standing again. Not alone, but with people beside me who believe. That is why I ask you, not for blind trust, but for shared courage. Let us rebuild this deal together. The boardroom stirred. Investors whispered to one another, weighing the risks, the rewards, and the unshakable conviction that now filled the room. Then, just as the atmosphere seemed to soften, a voice cut through like ice. Convincing, said a new figure, striding into the room. He was tall, sleek, dressed in an immaculate navy suit. His smirk carried the arrogance of a man who knew his wealth could bend the world. But not enough. Richard froze. His stomach dropped. He knew that voice. It was Alexander Crowe, his fiercest rival. Crowe's company had been circling like a vulture, waiting for Richard's empire to collapse so he could swallow what remained. And now, here he was, barging into the boardroom like he owned it. Apologies for being late, Crowe said smoothly, though everyone knew he had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I heard there was trouble, and I thought I'd save you all the headache by offering a cleaner deal. He slid a folder onto the table. Contracts, numbers, promises. The investors shifted instantly. Some eyes lit up at the sight of figures that glittered with guaranteed profits. Richard's heart pounded. He could see it, the deal slipping away, investors lured by Crowe's golden words. Crow turned to him with a mocking smile. "It seems, Sterling, that you've lost your touch. A pity. But don't worry, I'll take good care of what you leave behind." The humiliation stung. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came, and then Grace stepped forward again. She placed a single hand on Richard's arm, grounding him, steadying him. Then she faced Crow head on. "Mr. Crow," she said firmly, "you may have numbers, that shine. But what you don't have is loyalty. You don't have trust. You don't have the heart of this company. And that is something you can never buy, no matter how many zeros you add." The boardroom went still. Investors' eyes darted between Crow and Grace. Crow's smirk faltered for just a second. "And who are you to lecture me on business?" he sneered. Grace didn't flinch. "I am the maid who just saved a deal you came here to steal." Gasps rippled across the room. Even Richard couldn't hide his shock. Grace's courage was blazing like fire, and it was burning away every shadow of doubt in the room. Crow's smirk returned, but thinner now. "We'll see about that," he muttered, retreating slightly. But everyone in the room had seen it. For the first time, Crow had been silenced, not by Richard Sterling, billionaire, but by Grace, the maid who had refused to let fear win. And in that moment, Richard realized this battle was far from over. But he was no longer fighting it alone. The boardroom air grew heavy, thick with tension as Alexander Crow leaned back in his chair, his smirk stretching like a knife across his face. The investors whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Richard, Grace, and the rival, Billionaire who had entered like a predator sensing blood. Richard clenched his fists beneath the table, his jaw tightening. He knew Crow too well. The man didn't come here to negotiate. He came to destroy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crow began, his voice smooth as silk, "I admire the courage displayed here, truly. But courage doesn't pay the bills. Numbers do. My proposal offers you security, profit, and peace of mind. Something Sterling has clearly failed to provide." He slid his documents across the table. They glittered with promises of quick returns and guaranteed percentages, an illusion of perfection. The investors leaned in, their curiosity sparking. Victoria Hayes, sharp and calculating, picked up the folder and skimmed it with interest. "These are substantial," she admitted, her eyes flickering with greed. Richard's heart sank. He could already feel them slipping away. Grace stepped forward before the silence could consume them. "Substantial, yes," she said, her voice steady, "but empty." Crow arched an eyebrow. "Empty? Do enlighten us, Maid." Gasps rustled around the table. Some investors chuckled nervously. Others leaned forward, curious to see how this unassuming woman would dare challenge a man like Crow. Grace didn't flinch. She walked to the center of the room, her simple uniform stark against the gleaming suits. "Numbers can be twisted, promises can be written. But ask yourselves, what kind of man writes them? Richard Sterling built this company from nothing, with sweat, sacrifice, and yes, mistakes. But Crow, he builds with greed. He feeds on the weak. And when he's done, he leaves nothing but ruins." Crow's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, chuckling. "Touching. But this isn't a fairy tale, Miss Grace. This is business. And in business, the only thing that matters is the bottom line." "No," Grace countered sharply. "The only thing that matters is trust. Without trust, numbers mean nothing. You want proof? Look at the companies Crow has touched. How many of them still exist today? How many workers still have jobs? How many communities are thriving?" The investors shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided Crow's eyes. They knew she was right. His reputation was one of quick profits and long-term destruction. Richard felt a surge of pride watching her. Grace was fighting battles he had been too afraid to face. She wasn't just saving a deal. She was saving him. Crow's smile hardened. You think you're clever, don't you? He leaned forward, his voice dripping venom. But let's be clear, you're nothing. A maid pretending to understand billions. Do you really think anyone here will choose you over me? Grace's eyes burned with quiet fire. I don't need them to choose me. I only need them to see the truth. And once you see truth, you can never unsee it. The words struck the room like a hammer. For a moment, even Crow had no reply. But then, with calculated cruelty, he turned his attack toward Richard. Sterling, he said, his voice like poison. You hide behind your maid because you can't face the fact that you're finished. You've lost your edge. You've lost your power. And now, you let your servant speak for you. Pathetic, Richard stiffened, his face pale. The words cut deep, because in part, they were true. He had hidden behind Grace's courage. The investors waited, eyes locked on Richard. This was his moment. If he faltered now, everything would collapse. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence was brutal. Crow leaned back, triumphant. As I said, finished. Grace's voice sliced through the tension. He's not finished. Every head turned to her. Grace walked closer to Richard, her steps steady. She turned to the investors, her voice rising with unshakable conviction. He is not finished, because men like Richard Sterling don't fall. They rise. They rise because they know what it means to fail and still keep going. Do you not see it? This is the test every leader must face. Do you want a man who has never stumbled, who has never bled, who has never known what it means to fight back from the ground? Or do you want the one who has lived through it and still stands here, willing to face you with everything he has left? Her voice trembled now, not with fear, but with raw passion. This is not just a company. This is a chance to prove that resilience wins, that loyalty wins, that heart wins. If you walk away today, you don't just lose money, you lose the chance to stand with something real, something worth believing in. The room fell silent. Her words hung in the air like fire, burning into every heart. Victoria Hayes set the folder down slowly, her eyes unreadable. You speak well, Miss Grace, she said softly. But words are still just words. How do we know this resilience will translate into results? Before Grace could answer, Richard finally found his voice. Because I will not let it be otherwise. The words burst out of him, rough but strong. His eyes locked onto Victoria's. She's right. I did fail. I doubted myself. I lost the trust of the people who believed in me, but I will not lose it again. If you want proof, then stay with me and see it happen. Don't just look at numbers on a page. Look at me. I will show you what this company can be. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Today. For the first time in hours, Richard's voice carried the weight of a leader. Not desperate, not broken, determined. Crow's smirk finally cracked. He saw it, the shift. The investors were no longer leaning toward him. They were leaning toward Sterling again. Fools, Crow spat under his breath. All of you, but... Victoria's eyes never left Richard's. She tapped her fingers on the table, her mind weighing every angle, every risk. Then she smiled faintly. Perhaps courage does count for something. Grace's heart raced. Was this the moment? Would they finally reclaim the deal? But even as hope sparked, Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Crow was not the kind of man to walk away quietly. If they had wounded him here, he would come back harder, sharper, more dangerous. And deep inside, Grace knew this battle was only the beginning of the storm. The boardroom clock ticked louder than ever, each second stretching like a blade across the silence. The investors sat on edge, caught between two worlds, one of fear and promises with Crow, the other of courage and truth with Richard and Grace. Crow's smirk had faded into a mask of icy calculation. His voice, when it came, was low and dangerous. "You think this is over, Sterling? You think some pretty words from your maid will erase the reality of your failure?" He snapped his fingers. His assistant rushed forward, placing a thick folder on the table. Crow slid it open with deliberate slowness. "This," he said, "is the truth. Documents detailing Sterling Industries' mounting debts, failing contracts, and missed deadlines. Evidence that your visionary leader has been spiraling for months. These aren't rumors. These are facts." The investors leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Papers shuffled. Numbers glared back at them, ugly, undeniable. Richard's throat tightened. He knew those numbers. They were real, and for a moment all the strength he had just gathered began to waver. Crow saw the weakness and pounced. "Do you see now? This company is a sinking ship, and you want to bet your futures on a maid's speeches and a broken man's promises? Or would you rather place your trust in stability, in guarantees, in me?" The room buzzed with murmurs. Doubt was creeping back in. Grace stepped closer to Richard, whispering just loud enough for him to hear. "Don't break now. They're waiting to see if you believe in yourself. If you fall, they'll fall away too." Her words steadied him, like a hand pulling him from drowning waters. He took a deep breath. Then, to everyone's surprise, Richard stood. He didn't look at the documents Crow had spread like weapons. He didn't look at the investors either. He looked straight at Grace. "You were right," he said, his voice strong. "I failed. I lost control. I let fear dictate my choices, and I thought that meant I was finished." He turned now to the investors, his eyes burning. "But what Crow calls failure, I call proof. Proof that I've fallen, and I know exactly how hard the ground is, which means I know exactly how to get back up. He can show you numbers from my worst moments, but what he can't show you is the fire that's still burning here." He struck his chest with his fist. "Right here." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard's voice had changed. This was no longer the man who had doubted himself. This was the leader they had once followed. Crow laughed bitterly. "Touching, truly. But inspiration doesn't pay salaries. Numbers do. And your numbers are—" Grace cut him off. "And what about your numbers, Mr. Crow?" Every eye turned to her. She walked toward the table, her steps slow, deliberate. "Shall we talk about the factory in Ohio you shut down last year? Or the 300 workers who lost their jobs overnight while you pocketed the profits? Or the lawsuits buried under your lawyers' desks, waiting to explode the moment someone dares open them?" Crow's face darkened. "Careful, Maid." But Grace didn't stop. Her voice rose, steady and fierce. "He hides behind numbers because they're the only thing that can't show his reflection. But ask the people he's crushed. Ask the families he's left with nothing. Ask the towns his greed has turned into graveyards. Those are numbers too, Mr. Crow, just not the ones you're willing to show." The silence in the room was suffocating. Investors shifted uneasily, some nodding, some whispering. Victoria Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying Grace with sharp eyes. "You seem to know quite a lot for a maid." Grace met her gaze without fear. "Because I've lived it. While billionaires fight in boardrooms, people like me live with the consequences. I've seen what greed does, and I've seen what resilience looks like. That's why I believe in Richard Sterling, because he doesn't just want to win, he wants to rebuild, and that is something Crow will never give you." Her words pierced the air like lightning. For the first time, Crow looked unsettled. He slammed his fist on the table. "Enough! This is absurd! She is a servant, nothing more. And you all sit here listening to her like she holds the key to your empires. Are you blind?" Victoria's lips curved into a faint smile. "Perhaps we're just opening our eyes." Crow's face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this," he snarled. He grabbed his documents, his voice rising to a venomous roar. "Mark my words, Sterling. You and your maid will drown in the weight of your own foolishness." He stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing like thunder. The boardroom fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to Richard and Grace. For a moment, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on them. Would the investors choose faith or fear? Finally, Victoria stood. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked to Richard. She extended her hand. "I'm in," she said firmly. "Not because of your numbers, not even because of your name, but because of her." She nodded toward Grace. If a Maid can see this company's worth more clearly than its own CEO, then maybe it deserves another chance. One by one, other investors rose. Some hesitated, but then nodded, murmuring their agreement. Hands extended. Agreements were made. The deal was saved. Richard felt a wave of relief crash over him. He turned to Grace, his voice breaking. I don't know how to thank you." Grace smiled softly. "Then don't. Just prove me right." Tears stung his eyes, but he blinked them away. This wasn't the time for weakness. It was the time for new beginnings. As the investors filed out, leaving Richard and Grace alone in the vast boardroom, Richard turned to her. "You know, today, you weren't my maid. You were my savior." Grace shook her head. "No, Mr. Sterling. I was just someone who refused to stay silent. The rest was always in you." He looked at her, humbled beyond words. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman who cleaned his floors, but as the woman who had rebuilt his future. Outside the boardroom windows, the city skyline gleamed with the light of a new day. Richard knew there would still be battles ahead. Crow would come back. Failures would come again. But now, he also knew he would never face them alone. And Grace? She walked out of that boardroom not just a maid, but a force that had shaken billionaires to their core. The story of the billionaire who failed, and the maid who fixed it in seconds, would echo for years to come.